Hi everyone, it's good to see you. In this brief video, I'll be talking a little bit about the idea that psychopathology is relatable. Or in other words, these abnormal psychological experiences that we've been learning about, symptoms, disorders, what have you, that they are actually not so abnormal, that they are the sort of things that everyday people could relate to, that they're not so out of this world. So I have a few different examples that I'll walk through. I'll wrap it up at the end with some quotes that I think sort of tie this into a nice little package, and then that'll be it for this video. Okay? So I'd like to start with a little bit of rationale for why I think this is important. And in any class that I teach about mental health, I try to make the case that people really can relate to these kinds of problems. That's because, A, I think this helps fight stigma, so it gets people a little more comfortable talking about their experiences if they hear from others that, oh, other people can understand this too, that it really is relatable, I'm not so unlike you, and you can understand me. So I think that helps break down stigma, and as a consequence helps people to feel more comfortable seeking treatment, which is really important. And secondly, it's just more scientifically accurate to have us understand that the experiences people go through when they are fighting a mental disorder really are parts of the human condition, and that they're not so out there. That's what the science says, is that many of these things are on a spectrum, and most people experience them to some extent, greater or lesser, but it's not this all or nothing sort of deal for most people. So, I'll give you a few examples of what I mean, and the earlier ones are probably going to be easier to grasp, and the later ones might take a little more work, but I still think it's doable. So, I'll start with this idea of anxiety. Most people can relate to anxiety, right? So just think of the last time that you were really stressed. Maybe a job interview, maybe a first date, maybe you had to give a presentation in a class or something. You found yourself thinking about people judging you, or you found yourself feeling warmer than normal inside, or an upset stomach, or your thoughts were sort of racing and had a lot of what-if kinds of questions involved. For nearly everyone, anxiety is a relatable experience. To understand what it would be like to have an anxiety disorder, you simply have to stretch a little bit the significance of those anxious problems and the frequency and how long they last. You stretch that just a little bit, and now you meet clinical criteria. You're diagnosable with an anxiety disorder, right? So for one person who maybe meets criteria for social anxiety disorder and another person who doesn't, if you think a little bit about the last time you were really stressed, the two of you are probably talking the same language. It's not incommunicable. It's not this bridge that other people couldn't understand, right? You can cross that bridge. Depression is another. Most people at some time or another have felt down about something. They've experienced grief or loss or a sense of failure, a sense of immense guilt. Right? And this may not be something that happens all the time in their life, but it's probably happened at least occasionally. And so again, if you take that experience to think to yourself, what was it like when I was really down? And just expand that idea a bit so that it lasts 2 weeks to 2 months or more, rather than the couple of days that maybe you experienced it. And now what you're thinking about might be pretty close to what a depressed person experiences. Right? These are just parts of being alive. Okay, to give you a couple statistics that support that idea, approximately 23% of people, not just people diagnosed with a disorder, right, but 23% of the population will experience a panic attack at some point, at least one. So that's about a quarter of the human population that can relate to the idea of a panic attack, even if they never meet full-blown DSM criteria for panic disorder. They've had a panic attack before. So clearly that idea is relatable to them. Let's try another one. Trauma. About 70% or more of the human population will experience a trauma during their lifetime. Most of those folks will not go on to develop PTSD, of course, but they can understand the idea of what a trauma felt like to them. They have that memory of it. They can appreciate the idea of maybe having flashbacks or of struggling with getting over what the trauma was. Okay, so it's not this totally foreign idea. In fact, it's shared amongst most of humanity. Okay, here's another one, consumption issues. And by that I mean the things that we eat, the things that we don't eat when we're restricting our eating, or the kinds of psychoactive substances that we put in our bodies. Okay, drinking, using drugs, smoking. Most people at some point in life have had some sort of negative experience with regard to their consumption. For some, it might be that you ate far too much at a family gathering for a holiday, and you felt shame about that. Okay, that's one tiny little example. If you string a bunch of those in a row, you might begin to feel the emotional pain that someone with binge eating disorder feels. Okay, maybe that feels like a stretch, but we're still talking about a set of experiences that's all related on one spectrum. Okay, here's another. Have you ever felt negative about the way that your body looks? Maybe not to a diagnosable extent, but maybe you felt vulnerable in a swimsuit, or you felt like you weren't happy with the way that your body looked. That's the same set of thoughts that somebody with an eating disorder might be going through. Just again, if you take a non-clinical or non-diagnosable person who's experienced some of those things, stretch a little bit the severity and the timeline, and now we're talking about what a disorder might feel like. Okay, here's another statistic to throw at you just to support this idea. Approximately 1 in 6 U.S. adults has 4 or more binge drinking episodes in a month. Now, that's not the same as being alcohol dependent, physiologically speaking, but that's still a pretty high level of alcohol use that could be dangerous or problematic, and is on that spectrum with alcoholism or alcohol use disorder. Okay, so this is not totally foreign to most people. Again, that number was 1 in 6 U.S. adults. Okay, so hopefully you hear those things and you can kind of relate to that. You can think, okay, sure, mental disorders in regards to eating, trauma, substance use, anxiety, and mood maybe are not so far out there. But hang on, how can I relate to someone with schizophrenia? Right, a psychotic disorder. How could I relate to the idea of having hallucinations and delusions? Your everyday student in a class or your everyday person walking down the street might find that very foreign and hard to understand. So let me try and make a case that that still is a part of the human experience and is not quite so unlike us. First of all, a hallucination, by the way, is any sort of perceptual experience that's not grounded in reality. So common examples include hearing voices or seeing things that are not there. Approximately 10 to 15% of adults in a non-clinical population, so of all adults, approximately 10 to 15% will hallucinate at least once in life. That's not entirely a rare number. That's a pretty big slice of the population. 10 to 15% will hallucinate at least once. Okay, so that's a decent chunk of people that can at least appreciate what it might be like to hear something that wasn't really there, see something that wasn't really there. And maybe you can relate to this too. Think of a time when you saw something out of the corner of your eye, or you had some unusual out-of-body experience, some kind of weird deja vu sort of thing. We take those experiences and stretch them a little bit, and we might be talking about what psychosis feels like. Let's try the other hallmark of psychotic disorders, and that is delusions. So a delusion is a cognitive process or a belief of some kind which is not grounded in reality. And they can vary from being unrealistic but plausible to rather bizarre, right? So an unrealistic but plausible belief could be that a famous celebrity is in love with me. It could be that the FBI is tracking me and that someone is stalking me, right? Or that the President of the United States is sending me secret messages. All those things are quite unrealistic, and there's no evidence in the real world supporting those ideas, but it's possible. A more bizarre or out there delusion might be something like, my organs are melting, or my brain is turning to sand. And you'll sometimes hear folks struggling with a psychotic disorder say things like that they believe those sorts of things. So relating to the idea of a delusion might be easier if we start with the plausible kinds of things, right? What in your life might be like a delusion? Can you think of anything that you believe or that you hold to be true even though you don't have real-world evidence? Maybe you already know what I'm talking about. For about 85% of the world population, they have some sort of religious belief. And maybe this is thin ice to draw an analogy between religious beliefs and delusions. And I don't at all mean that to be insulting. The point I'm making is that the whole point of a faith is that one must believe in it in the absence of physical real-world proof. And throughout the history of man, we've had thousands of different religions, right? With all sorts of different creation stories, explanations for why we're here, what happens after we die, how to create meaning, how to create ethics, that involve all sorts of things that don't fit within the scope of the real, tangible, observable world, right? Talking animals, angels and demons coming out of the sky, gods or goddesses of many different kinds that control weather or landscapes or all sorts of different things, right? Is that so unlike a delusion? Interestingly, when you talk to folks with schizophrenia and you challenge them on their delusions, those are beliefs that are very firmly held for them. So if you were trying to tell someone, look, Steve, the president is not actually stalking you, or listen, Larry, Katy Perry really does not have a crush on you, and her lyrics in her music are not a secret love letter to you. That is just not realistic. There's no evidence for that. Folks struggling with schizophrenia will often double down and come up with some kind of yeah but response and some kind of logic that supports their delusion. And that may sound very out there to you, but let's imagine for a second that you're a religious person and someone challenges those beliefs of yours. Imagine that you're Christian and someone says to you, there's no such thing as God, or it's not possible that a virgin had a son, right, gave birth without having sexual intercourse. It's not possible that a snake could talk and convince someone to take a bite out of a forbidden fruit, right? These things are impossible. Your faith is wrong. You may think to yourself, well, I know what I know, and there's rationale that supports that, right? You would likely tighten up a bit. You would try to come up with a way to argue against them. And what I'm trying to say is that experience, that rigidity, that firmness of belief in the absence of real-world proof might be a lot like what a suffering schizophrenic person experiences when others ridicule or challenge their delusional beliefs. Those two things are not so unlike. Getting through life is difficult and complicated, and many of us hold on to beliefs that just simply can't be proven in the real world in any way. That's not necessarily abnormal or pathological. That's a common part of the human experience, right? So maybe, although it may sound on surface level that schizophrenia or the occasionally psychotic parts of bipolar, that these would be just totally out of touch with the rest of humanity, that may not be the case. Maybe you can relate to what it's like to be schizophrenic. So I want to leave you with a few quotes that I think kind of tie this all together. The first is from Friedrich Nietzsche. He's a well-known existential philosopher. He said, "To live is to suffer." That's not exactly uplifting, Dr. Pashik. Why are you telling me this? The reason I think it speaks to this issue is that he didn't say some people's lives are suffering and other people get to be normal. No, he said to live is to suffer, period. We all experience suffering, we all experience distress, and although the certain kinds of suffering that we go through may vary, the length of time, the severity, the shape that it takes may be different from person to person, we all know what it is to suffer. So in that way, being abnormal is not that abnormal. Here's another for you from Irvin Yalom, a well-known psychiatrist who's done a lot of writing on group therapy and existential counseling skills. He says, "The difference between normality and pathology is quantitative, not qualitative." If you remember your basic definitions of quantitative and qualitative, in the one we're talking about differing amounts, and in the other we're talking about categorical differences, right? So things like favorite colors versus how many years old are you, quantitative being the number. So if pathology is a quantity rather than a quality, then that means we all have that quantity to some extent. To boil it down, we're all a little bit crazy, we're all a little bit abnormal, and that's just part of being human, and that's okay. Here's another for you from Jonathan Shedler. He's a well-written psychotherapist who's been seeing clients for decades. He says, "I've never treated a person so disturbed that I couldn't see something of he or she in me." And so he's saying with every patient that he's ever sat with, there was a part of that person that he could relate to, that he had felt that too, that he had been through something like that as well. And that made it easier for him to sympathize and empathize and provide a knowing compassion to that person because it was a shared human experience they were talking about. One more for you, and that's from the DSM, so straight from the introductory chapter. So the APA says, "Hence the level at which an experience becomes problematic or pathological will differ. The boundaries between normality and pathology vary across cultures for specific types of behaviors. Thresholds of tolerance for specific symptoms or behaviors differ across cultures, social settings, and families. Thus, the judgment that a given behavior is abnormal or requires clinical attention depends on cultural norms." So even in the official diagnostic manual, which provides us these categories of what is normal and what is not normal, abnormal, they say right in the beginning, this depends greatly upon one's culture of origin, their society, their family structure. These things vary widely. And so if we think about these boundaries being not so much a fence between two different kinds of living, but rather a spectrum, I think it's more relatable that way. We can all understand what it's like to suffer. We can all understand what distress is like. So, to tie it all back together, again, the key idea here is that psychopathology is actually relatable for all of us. We can imagine what it would be like to go through these various kinds of problems, whether they be anxiety or mood-oriented, trauma-oriented, regarding consumption, psychotic features, or any other kind of psychopathology. We really can relate to that. So, thank you for listening. Have a wonderful day.